Think of the most famous image of a jester you've ever seen, maybe in a grand oil painting hanging in a museum, or a scene from your favorite historical drama. That figure in mismatched colors with a belled cap and a mocking grin, dancing and tumbling to amuse a king. We're taught to see them as simple fools, harmless entertainers whose only job was laughter. But what if everything you thought you knew about these colorful characters was completely wrong? What if the laughter they provoked was merely a mask, a brilliant disguise for something far more cunning and perilous? Behind the jingling bells and the painted smile lay a world of whispered secrets, of political schemes played out not in shadowy council chambers, but in the bright public light of the throne room. These were not just fools, they were often the most dangerous people in the castle. Welcome to a journey into the hidden corridors of power in the medieval world, a journey that will permanently change how you view the court jester. We are about to pull back the velvet curtain on their secret lives, revealing them as masterful spies, as subtle political players who could make or break a king with a carefully timed joke, and as the unexpected keepers of the realm's darkest, most volatile secrets. They possessed a unique and terrifying power, the power of truth disguised as folly. In an age where speaking plainly to a monarch could mean losing your head, the jester held the singular privilege of saying the unsayable. But that privilege came at a staggering cost, weaving them into a web of intrigue and danger from which few could ever truly escape. So, prepare to see the entire medieval court anew. We will explore how these men and women, often plucked from the fringes of society, became the silent architects of history, their antics hiding a razor-sharp intellect and a network of influence that stretched across kingdoms. This is not just a story of jokes and juggling. It is a story of survival, of espionage, and of the profound courage it took to live a double life in plain sight, where one misstep, one joke that landed a little too close to the bone, could turn the laughter into a death sentence. This is the secret, astonishing, and often treacherous world of the medieval court jester. This astonishing freedom was known as the jester's license, or sometimes the privilege of the bauble. That bauble, the mock scepter carried by the fool, was far more than a prop. It was a powerful symbol. It represented a formal, understood agreement between the monarch and the fool, a unique contract that suspended the normal, brutal rules of courtly conduct. In a world where a nobleman could be stripped of his titles or even his life for a single misspoken word of advice, the jester alone could voice uncomfortable truths, harsh criticisms, and biting social commentary under the thin but effective veil of humor. This wasn't merely about getting a laugh, it was a brilliantly calculated tool for governance. Kings and queens, often isolated by sycophants and flatterers, used their jesters as a kind of sanctioned whistleblower, a channel to hear the raw, unfiltered pulse of their court and their kingdom. The jester's antics provided a safety valve, allowing tensions and grievances to be aired in a controlled, performative way that ultimately reinforced the ruler's authority by demonstrating their magnanimity and strength in tolerating such boldness. Consider the legendary French jester Triboulet, who served King Francis I. The story goes that the king, in a moment of fury, threatened to have Triboulet executed for an insult. But even in his rage, the king offered a merciful choice. Triboulet could select his own manner of death. The jester, with impeccable timing, reportedly replied, "Good sire, for the sake of Saint Nituch and Saint Pansard, patrons of insanity, I choose to die of old age." The sheer absurdity of the request, couched in the language of folly, diffused the situation entirely. The king laughed and the sentence was commuted. This tale perfectly illustrates the delicate dance of the jester's license. The joke worked not just because it was clever, but because it operated within a recognized and accepted social framework. The king was expected to be angered, and the jester was expected to find a witty escape. It was a scripted performance of rebellion that ultimately upheld the monarch's power to grant life. This privileged position made the jester a vital component of the court's political ecosystem, but it was a role fraught with peril. The license was not a blanket immunity. It was a temporary, revocable pass that depended entirely on the monarch's mood, the political climate, and the jester's own skill in walking a razor's edge. A joke that landed perfectly one day could be seen as treasonous the next if the winds of power shifted. The jester had to be a master psychologist, reading the king's face for the slightest flicker of genuine offense beneath the laughter. They had to know precisely how far to push, which truths could be told with a light touch, and which were better left unspoken. This constant, high-stakes calculation made the jester's life one of immense psychological pressure. They lived in a gilded cage, celebrated for their wit, yet always one misstep away from the dungeon or the executioner's block, their celebrated license transforming in an instant from a shield into a death warrant. So, with this incredible and dangerous license established, it's natural to wonder, who were these individuals bold enough to take on such a perilous role? Where did they come from? The journey from an ordinary life to the gilded halls of a royal palace was as varied as the jesters themselves, and their origins often held the key to their unique brand of humor and their surprising resilience. Far from a single glamorous career path, recruitment into the jester's motley was frequently a story of chance, talent, and sometimes sheer misfortune. One of the most common and often most heartbreaking routes was through physical difference. In an era that poorly understood disability, individuals with dwarfism, unusual proportions, or other physical characteristics were sometimes taken from their families or given up by them to serve as natural fools. They were viewed as living curiosities, and their very presence was considered a form of entertainment for the nobility. Their folly was seen as innate, a divine or natural joke, and their role was to be a perpetual object of amusement. Yet within this cruel framework, many of these so-called natural fools displayed a sharp and cunning intelligence, using the low expectations of the court to their advantage. They learned to play the part expected of them while subtly observing everything, proving that the real foolishness lay in underestimating them. Their survival depended on turning their perceived weakness into a unique kind of strength, a survival tactic honed from a lifetime of being misunderstood. A very different path was carved by those who earned their place through sheer skill and talent. These were the licensed fools, professional entertainers whose wit and abilities were so remarkable they couldn't be ignored. A wandering minstrel with a razor-sharp tongue for satire, an acrobat capable of breathtaking feats, or a musician who could compose a witty, improvised song about current events, any of them might catch the eye of a traveling noble and be offered a permanent position. For these individuals, the court was the pinnacle of their career, a chance for stable patronage and a much wider audience. They were the artists and intellectuals of the comedic world, and their humor was a carefully crafted weapon. They studied the court, learned its politics, and tailored their performances to navigate its complex social hierarchies. Their recruitment was a testament to their talent, but it came with the immense pressure of having to constantly perform at the highest level, with their wit being the only thing standing between them and dismissal or disgrace. Then there were the most unpredictable recruits, prisoners of war or individuals from conquered territories. A witty nobleman captured from a rival court, known for his sharp tongue, might be forced into the jester's role as a form of humiliation, a constant reminder of his subjugation. Yet, for a clever prisoner, this could also become a surprising avenue for influence and even revenge. From inside the court, they could gather intelligence, sow dissent with carefully coded jokes, and slowly work to undermine their captor. Their background gave them a unique perspective. They understood the enemy court intimately, and their barbs carried the weight of genuine grievance. This made them exceptionally dangerous, and if they were skillful enough, exceptionally valuable. Their recruitment was born from conflict, and their entire tenure was often a continuation of that conflict by other means, a psychological war fought with laughter as the weapon. These diverse backgrounds created a melting pot within the Jester's quarters. A natural fool might work alongside a brilliant satirist and a captive knight, each learning from the other's methods. This blend of the involuntary and the professional, the born and the made, created the complex, multifaceted figure we recognize. Understanding these origins is crucial because it shatters the monolithic image of the simple clown. It reveals that the Jester's power didn't just come from a license granted by the king. It was forged in the fires of their own unique and often difficult pasts. They brought the perspectives of the outsider, the talent of the artist, and the cunning of the survivor into the very heart of power, and that combination is what made them so uniquely equipped to speak truth to it. Now, let's take a closer look at the Jester's iconic costume, because these weren't just random bits of silly attire. Every single element was a deliberate part of a carefully constructed disguise, a uniform that communicated a complex set of rules to everyone in the court. The two most important pieces of this uniform were the bauble and the coxcomb, and each was loaded with meaning and potential for hidden utility. First, the bauble. This was the Jester's constant companion, a mock scepter that was a brilliant piece of symbolic theater. In a king's hand, a scepter represents supreme authority and power. In the Jester's hand, it was a parody of that very power, a constant visual reminder that his words, no matter how sharp, were ultimately just part of the act. But this prop was far from useless. It was an extension of the Jester's own body, a tool for physical comedy, for pointing out individuals in the crowd to involve them in a routine, or for pantomiming elaborate stories. More intriguingly, some historians and replica makers have noted that the hollowed-out baubles, especially those with a carved head at the top, could have served as a perfect secret compartment. Imagine the possibilities. A tiny, rolled-up scrap of parchment with a sensitive message could be tucked inside, or a small lock of hair or a token from a secret lover. In the middle of a performance, a jester could pass dangerously close to a conspirator and transfer intelligence without a single word being exchanged, all under the guise of his chaotic tumbling. The bauble was the perfect cover who would suspect the fool's silly stick of being a vessel for secrets. Then there was the coxcomb, that distinctive hat, often red, with its peaks resembling a rooster's comb. On the surface, this was the ultimate symbol of the jester's supposed foolishness. The rooster was a traditional symbol of vanity and empty-headed pride, so wearing its likeness was a public declaration of being a simpleton. But this was a classic case of reverse psychology in action. By openly branding himself as a fool, the jester was actually disarming his audience and creating a powerful psychological space for his true work. The coxcomb was a badge that said, "Nothing I say is to be taken seriously," thereby granting him the freedom to say absolutely everything. It was a brilliant legal and social loophole. A nobleman insulting another nobleman could start a feud, but a man in a rooster hat delivering the same insult was just being a funny fool. The costume, therefore, wasn't a mark of shame but a suit of armor. It provided a layer of psychological protection, allowing the person inside to operate with a level of social freedom granted to no one else. Together, the bauble and the coxcomb formed the core of a persona that was both transparent and utterly opaque. Everyone saw the flamboyant fool, but only the most perceptive understood they were watching a master of espionage, a political commentator, and a trusted confidant, all hiding in the most obvious place imaginable, right in the center of the room, waving a funny stick and jingling his bells. And it was this very costume, this mask of insignificance, that opened every door in the castle, transforming the jester from a mere entertainer into the crown's most effective and elusive spy. Imagine the scene: a nobleman huddled in a shadowy corner of the great hall, whispering a carefully guarded secret to a co-conspirator. They would be wary of the guards, the servants, even other nobles. But the jester, he was just part of the furniture, a colorful, babbling piece of the background noise. His perceived lack of consequence was his greatest weapon. Because he was not seen as a political player, people spoke freely in front of him, often forgetting he was even there. This granted him access to a torrent of unguarded conversations, from the treasonous grumblings of disaffected barons in the courtyard to the intimate gossip exchanged between ladies in waiting in the royal chambers. His license to roam was virtually unlimited. He could drift from the smoky kitchens where servants gossiped about their masters, straight into the throne room itself, all without raising an eyebrow. He was the one person who could cross the rigid social boundaries of the medieval world without challenge, a silent witness to the private lives of everyone from the scullery maid to the sovereign. This unique mobility made the Jester a master of intelligence gathering, a walking ear for the crown. His primary mission was to absorb the atmosphere of the court, to gauge the subtle shifts in loyalty and discontent that could signal danger for the monarch. A joke that once landed well with a certain lord might now be met with a tense, stony silence, a tiny clue that that lord's allegiance might be wavering. The Jester would notice which nobles were suddenly spending a lot of time together, their whispered conversations stopping the moment a more loyal figure approached. He would hear the rumors bubbling up from the lower levels of the castle, stories of a new tax being hated or a military campaign being questioned. All of this intelligence was priceless. The Jester acted as the ruler's early warning system, detecting the tremors of potential rebellion long before they erupted into open conflict. He wasn't just listening for specific plots. He was constantly taking the temperature of the entire kingdom, one unguarded moment at a time. But how did he deliver this sensitive information without blowing his cover? The method was as ingenious as the role itself. The Jester didn't march into the king's private chambers to deliver a formal, written report. That would have shattered the illusion of the harmless fool and exposed him as a purposeful agent. Instead, he used his performance as a perfect Trojan horse for intelligence. He would approach the throne under the familiar and expected pretense of sharing a funny new story or a bit of court gossip. Woven into his tale, disguised as a humorous anecdote about a fictional, foolish knight or a silly baker, would be the crucial details of a real conspiracy. He could pantomime the actions of the conspirators, using his bauble to represent them, all under the cover of a comedic routine. The king or queen, privy to the code, would understand the truth hidden within the foolery. A joke about a greedy badger hoarding nuts for a cold winter might be a warning that a certain baron was stockpiling weapons. The Jester's entire art form became a sophisticated encryption system, allowing him to transmit vital secrets in plain sight, with the court's laughter providing the perfect background noise for treason. History provides us with tantalizing hints of this shadowy function. While official records are sparse for obvious reasons, the legend of the Jester Raha, who served King Henry I of England, is deeply suggestive. Raha was a well-known figure, a charismatic and witty man who eventually founded the famous St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, but his earlier life at court is shrouded in intrigue. It's widely speculated that his closeness to the king and his ability to move seamlessly through all levels of society was no accident. He would have been perfectly positioned to hear the murmurs of discontent following Henry's ascension to the throne, a time rife with potential challenges to his power. Raha's legendary wit and his later profound religious conversion could easily be read as the journey of a man who had seen too much from the shadows, a man who used his position as a fool to navigate the deadly currents of power before ultimately seeking a different kind of purpose. His story reminds us that the most effective spies are the ones whose true allegiance and purpose remain a mystery, their greatest secrets dying with them, leaving only whispers and legends behind. This sophisticated system of espionage relied on a shared, secret language between the Jester and the monarch, a language woven from the very fabric of their public performances. The most potent weapon in this hidden arsenal was the double entendre, a phrase or joke with two meanings, one innocent and amusing for the general court, the other deadly serious for the king's ears alone. A jester might launch into a seemingly nonsensical story about a farmer with 3 sheep, one of whom kept trying to wander into the wolf's woods. To the assembled nobles, it's a silly parable about a stubborn animal. But for the king, who knows the jester's code, the 3 sheep represent 3 powerful earls, and the one wandering toward the wolf, a known rival kingdom, is a crystal-clear warning of a potential defector or traitor. The beauty of this method was its deniability. If ever confronted, the jester could simply play the fool, insisting it was just a meaningless story for a laugh, his motley costume providing the perfect excuse. This linguistic dance required immense intellectual agility from the jester and a deep, intuitive understanding from the monarch, turning every public routine into a potential intelligence briefing disguised as light entertainment. Beyond spoken jokes, the jester's musical and poetic talents offered another versatile channel for coded messages. A minstrel could travel freely between castles, and a jester with a lute was a common sight. A seemingly romantic ballad about a faithless lady could actually detail the shifting loyalties of a key duke's wife, whose influence over her husband was causing political instability. By changing a single word in a well-known song's chorus during a feast, the jester could signal that a pre-arranged plan was to proceed or be aborted. The rhythm, the key, or even the specific order of songs in a set could act as a cipher. A mournful dirge followed by a lively jig might indicate that a period of danger had passed and it was now safe to act. Poetry, with its inherent structure and potential for metaphor, was equally effective. A few improvised lines about a sickly eagle, too weak to leave its nest, could inform the king that a rival monarch was ill and his armies were standing down. These artistic forms were the perfect camouflage, allowing complex information to be transmitted in a way that was both public and utterly clandestine, hidden in the art that the court consumed without a second thought. The physicality of the jester's performance was equally rich with signaling potential. Their entire body was an instrument of communication, and a repertoire of seemingly random gestures and antics could convey precise instructions. Imagine a jester tumbling through the hall. A specific sequence of somersaults, perhaps 2 forward and 1 backward, could be a pre-arranged signal that a certain foreign ambassador had just been seen entering the castle gates. The way he juggled his colored balls could indicate the mood of the crowd. Dropping the red ball might signify rising anger among the barons, while catching all 3 green ones could mean the commoners outside the gates were calm and content. Even his interactions with other courtiers were a form of live action code. Lingering just a moment too long near one particular nobleman while pretending to adjust a loose bell on his sleeve could mark that individual as the person of interest in a wider conspiracy. A playful tap on the king's shoulder with his bauble at a precise angle could mean the meeting is confirmed for tonight, while a stumble at the queen's feet might be a desperate, last-minute signal to abort a dangerous plan. This kinetic language turned the jester's entire presence into a living, breathing signal flag, his every move a potential piece of a larger puzzle. The true genius of this system lay in its layered complexity and its reliance on the unique bond of trust between the fool and his sovereign. It wasn't just one method used in isolation, but a fluid combination of word, song, and gesture that could be adapted to any situation. A jester might begin with a poem containing a key metaphor, reinforce it with a specific gesture during a tumbling pass, and then cap it off with a joke that sealed the message's meaning for the king. This multi-sensory approach ensured clarity and reduced the risk of misinterpretation. For the court, it was a dazzling, chaotic display of folly. For the monarch, it was a detailed and urgent report. This constant, covert dialogue required the jester to be a master of timing and observation, gauging the perfect moment to deliver his coded performance when the king was watching but the conspirators were distracted. It was a high-wire act of communication, where the price of a mistimed joke or a misread gesture wasn't just a failed performance, but the collapse of a royal intelligence network and almost certainly the Jester's own head. Yet for all its clever utility, the Jester's license was a perilously fragile shield, one that could shatter in an instant if the delicate balance of court politics was disturbed. The freedom to speak truth to power was a double-edged sword, and history is littered with the stories of those who, whether by accident or design, finally sliced themselves upon its blade. The constant high-wire act of their profession meant that the line between a celebrated wit and a condemned traitor was often no wider than the edge of a well-turned phrase. Consider the chilling fate of Will Somers, the much-beloved jester of King Henry VIII of England. Somers was famously close to the mercurial king, his humor a rare constant through the monarch's many marriages and religious upheavals. Yet even he faced moments of mortal danger. On one occasion, Somers reportedly made a joke at the expense of the king's unpopular chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. The jest landed poorly, striking a nerve in the tense political climate. Enraged, Cromwell threatened to have the jester hanged. Somers only narrowly escaped this fate by throwing himself on the king's personal mercy, a desperate gamble that highlighted how even the most established and cherished fool was perpetually one misstep away from the gallows. His survival was the exception that proved the rule. His license saved him, but only just and only because the king willed it. The stakes were even higher for those who dared to target the monarch's personal pride or challenged the very foundation of their authority. In the court of the famously vain Queen Elizabeth I of England, her jester, a man named Richard Tarleton, once ventured a joke that cut a little too deep. Known for his razor-sharp improvisations, Tarleton made a public quip about the Queen's relationship with the Earl of Leicester. The details are lost, but the consequence was stark and immediate. The Queen, incensed by the personal nature of the jest and its threat to her carefully cultivated image, is said to have struck Tarleton with such force that she broke a bone in his head. The physical blow was a brutal reminder of the absolute power dynamic that underpinned their entire relationship. The license to jest was a gift, and it could be violently revoked. Tarleton's career survived this incident, but the story lived on as a grim warning to every jester who followed. The monarch's favor was a capricious thing, and a joke that touched a royal nerve could bring not just professional ruin but physical agony. More tragic still are the tales of jesters whose fates were sealed not by a single errant joke, but by becoming collateral damage in the brutal power struggles of the court. They were uniquely vulnerable, possessing dangerous knowledge but lacking the political alliances or noble blood that might protect a disgraced lord. When a regime changed or a conspiracy was uncovered, the jester who had heard and seen everything could suddenly become a liability. The Scottish jester Patrick Bonney serves as a heartbreaking example. He served James V of Scotland and was deeply devoted to his king. When James died, the court was thrown into turmoil. Patrick, overcome with genuine grief, was said to have lain at the foot of the royal tomb, refusing to eat or drink. According to the legend, he simply wasted away and died of a broken heart. While this is a poignant story of loyalty, some historians suggest a more sinister possibility. A jester who knew the secrets of the old king might have been seen as a dangerous loose end by the new regents ruling for the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. Whether his death was from sorrow or something more arranged, his story underscores the jester's ultimate powerlessness. Their lives were inextricably bound to their patrons. When the patron fell, the fool often fell with them, their celebrated license rendered meaningless by the cold realities of a succession crisis. Perhaps the most direct and horrifying example of the license's limits comes from the legend of the jester who told a king an unbearable truth. The story is attached to various figures across Europe, but its core remains consistent. A king, proud and arrogant, is leading his army to a pointless and costly war. His jester, in a final, desperate attempt to avert disaster, abandons all subtlety and metaphor. He looks the king directly in the eye and tells him in plain and simple language that his quest is foolish and will destroy the kingdom. The court falls silent. The veil of humor is gone, and with it the protection it afforded. The king, his authority publicly and nakedly challenged, has no choice. The jester, for speaking the very truth he was hired to uncover, is executed on the spot. This archetypal tale captures the ultimate paradox of the jester's existence. His purpose was to be a voice of reason and truth, but the system could only tolerate that truth when it was carefully wrapped in the comforting disguise of folly. To strip away the disguise was to reveal the dangerous man beneath the motley, and for that there could be no pardon. The jester's life was a continuous dance on a razor's edge, a performance where the audience's laughter was the only thing keeping him from a fatal drop, a reminder that in the medieval court, the most profound truths often had to be whispered by a fool, for anyone else who spoke them would surely die. These legendary figures were not just characters in folktales, they were living, breathing individuals who navigated the treacherous waters of royal favor with a blend of audacity and caution that defies belief. By stepping away from the archetype and meeting the actual people who wore the motley, we gain a much sharper, more human understanding of their world. Let's begin in the vibrant, chaotic French courts of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, where one man's wit became so famous it would inspire legends for centuries. Triboulet, who served both King Louis XII and King Francis I, was the very embodiment of the jester's dangerous power. He wasn't merely a funny man, he was a satirical force of nature, his tongue so sharp and his insults so piercing that he operated with what seemed like total impunity. The stories about him are numerous, but they all circle the same astonishing theme: his ability to say the unsayable and live. In one famous anecdote, Triboulet openly insulted Queen Claude, the wife of Francis I, calling her a fool. The king, enraged, gave Triboulet a chilling choice: apologize to the queen or face 100 lashes. The jester, with flawless comedic timing, replied, "Your Majesty, I did not know it was forbidden to state the obvious." The sheer, breathtaking gall of the remark, its perfect encapsulation of the jester's role as truth-teller, somehow diffused the royal fury. He wasn't punished. This incident reveals the core of Triboulet's art. He didn't just tell jokes, he held up a mirror to the court, reflecting its hypocrisies and absurdities back at itself with such brilliant framing that the king himself was forced to acknowledge the truth within the insult. His survival wasn't just luck, it was a testament to a master psychologist at work, a man who understood that the most potent weapon in his arsenal was a truth so undeniable that even a monarch had to concede to it, if only through reluctant laughter. Crossing the English Channel, we find a jester whose story is one of remarkable longevity and profound personal connection. Will Sommers, the beloved fool of King Henry VIII, presents a fascinating counterpoint to Triboulet's abrasive style. Sommers didn't survive the tumultuous Tudor court, with its revolving door of wives and its religious upheaval, by being the sharpest or most vicious wit. Instead, his genius lay in a deep, genuine humanity and a steadfast loyalty that transformed him from a mere entertainer into the king's trusted confidant. In the famous family portrait, The Family of Henry VIII, Will Sommers is depicted standing beside the king's son, Edward, a place of honor unimaginable for almost any other commoner. This visual record speaks volumes about his unique position. He was more than a fool, he was part of the royal household's emotional fabric. His humor was often gentle and observational, a comforting constant in a court where fortunes could rise and collapse overnight. The most poignant testimony to their bond came at the very end of Henry's life. As the formidable king lay dying, racked with pain and probably remorse, it was Will Sommers who was called to his bedside to offer comfort. While powerful dukes and scheming counselors waited anxiously outside, the jester was in the inner chamber, using the familiar tools of his trade one last time to ease the passage of the most powerful man in England. In that hushed room, the performance fell away, and what remained was the simple, powerful connection between two men who had journeyed through decades of history together. Summers's story teaches us that the Jester's ultimate power wasn't always in the cutting remark, but sometimes in the capacity for genuine friendship, a loyalty that could outlast even the tyrant's infamous rages. While the stories of Triboulet and Summers highlight the potential for long-term success, the tale of Jane Fool, sometimes known as Jane the Fool, who served Queen Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, opens a window into a much different, often overlooked aspect of this world. Jane is a compelling and somewhat mysterious figure, one of the few clearly identified female fools in the English court records. Her presence reminds us that the role was not exclusively male, and her title of Natural Fool suggests she may have had an intellectual or developmental disability, living in a time when such individuals were often marginalized or exploited. Yet the historical record treats Jane with a surprising degree of respect and care. She received regular wages, fine clothing, and was integrated into the Queen's household. This presents a more complex picture than simple exploitation. For Queen Catherine, a deeply intelligent and compassionate woman known for her religious scholarship and her nurturing nature, Jane may have been a source of innocent companionship, a soul untainted by the relentless political intrigue of the court. Jane's story forces us to confront the uncomfortable nuances of the Jester's world. It wasn't always a glamorous tale of witty wordplay. For some, it was a life of dependency, where survival hinged on the charity and protection of a powerful patron. Her enduring presence in the Tudor court suggests that the motley could also be a kind of sanctuary, a designated role that offered protection and purpose to someone who might have had few other options in a harsh and unforgiving society. Looking beyond the familiar courts of France and England, we find figures like Claus von Ranst, the jester to Duke Charles the Bold of Burgundy in the 15th century, whose story serves as a stark reminder of the literal battlefield risks these individuals could face. Claus was no mere hall fool. He was a constant companion to the Duke on his military campaigns. During the pivotal Battle of Nancy in 1477, a disastrous conflict that would claim the Duke's life, Claus von Ranst fought and died by his master's side. His presence on the front lines was symbolic in the deepest sense. It demonstrated that the jester's duty was not confined to the throne room. His loyalty extended to sharing his patron's ultimate fate. He was part of the Duke's inner circle until the very end, his death blurring the line between court entertainer and sworn retainer. This final, fatal solidarity elevates the jester's role from a performance to a profound bond of service. These individuals, the sharp-tongued Triboulet, the loyal Summers, the cared for Jane, and the faithful Claus, were not interchangeable archetypes. They were distinct personalities who used their unique skills and circumstances to carve out a place in history. Their collective stories show us that there was no single path to being a fool. The motley was a costume that could be worn in 100 different ways, each one a unique strategy for survival at the foot of the throne. But for a truly breathtaking example of how far a jester's influence could reach, we must turn to the remarkable and turbulent career of Archibald Armstrong, the most powerful and ultimately the most notorious fool in the history of the English court. His story is a masterclass in the potential trajectory of a jester's life, a dramatic arc that saw him rise from humble beginnings to become a wealthy political operator, only to plummet from the highest favor for the very same audacity that lifted him there. Archie, as he was known, entered the service of King James I of England after initially serving in the Scottish household of James VI before the king's ascension to the English throne. He was not a natural fool, but a licensed one, a sharp-witted Scotsman whose humor resonated deeply with his fellow countryman monarch. James, a complex man who was both highly intellectual and notoriously informal, developed a profound fondness for Archie, a bond that went far beyond the typical patron-performer relationship. This wasn't just a king enjoying his jester's company. This was a deep, personal affinity that Armstrong learned to exploit with brilliant, ruthless efficiency. His rise to prominence was nothing short of meteoric, fueled by a combination of genuine wit and a keen understanding of the political marketplace. Armstrong's jester's license became a license to print money. He realized that his unique access to the king was a commodity that everyone at court was desperate to purchase. Ambitious courtiers and foreign ambassadors soon learned that a well-placed bribe to Archie could smooth the path to a royal audience, or that a generous gift might ensure the jester would whisper their petition in the king's ear at an opportune moment. He became a fabulously wealthy man, amassing a fortune that included estates and an income that would be the envy of many nobles. But his power wasn't merely financial. Armstrong inserted himself directly into the heart of England's most critical political and religious debates. He was a virulent anti-Catholic and used his platform to fiercely mock and undermine the Spanish match, the deeply unpopular plan to marry the king's son, the future Charles I, to a Spanish Catholic princess. His jokes and satires against the Spanish and their supporters were not just entertainment. They were potent political propaganda that swayed public opinion and echoed the sentiments of a powerful Protestant faction within the court. For a time, Archibald Armstrong was less a court jester and more a partisan operative, his motley costume camouflaging a figure of immense, tangible influence. This incredible ascent, however, made his eventual fall all the more spectacular and instructive. Armstrong's success bred a fatal overconfidence, leading him to forget the fundamental, fragile nature of his position. His power was entirely derivative, flowing directly from the king's personal favor, and he made the catastrophic error of believing it was his own. The turning point came when he went too far in his constant feud with the powerful Duke of Buckingham, George Villiers, the king's favorite and the most influential man in the kingdom after the monarch himself. Armstrong had long traded barbs with Buckingham, but the Duke's own power was as dependent on the king's whim as the jester's was. The final, unforgivable insult occurred during a pivotal and disastrous military expedition. Buckingham had led a naval force to attack the Spanish port of Cadiz, a mission that ended in humiliating failure. Upon the Duke's return, Archibald Armstrong, in a moment of what he must have thought was triumphant mockery, publicly taunted Buckingham. The exact words are lost, but the sentiment was clear. He jeered at the Duke for his military incompetence and his catastrophic loss. This time, the joke did not land. It exploded. Buckingham, already smarting from the public disgrace and political damage of the failed campaign, was in no mood to tolerate insults from a jester, no matter how favored. He demanded satisfaction from the king. King James, who relied on Buckingham perhaps more than any other advisor, was faced with a stark choice between his longtime fool and his indispensable chief minister. The decision was swift and brutal. Armstrong's license was instantly revoked. He was formally dismissed from court, stripped of his position, his income, and his privileged access. The man who had once manipulated the levers of power was now utterly powerless, cast out from the world he had dominated for so long. His wealth may have remained, but his influence evaporated overnight. The fall of Archibald Armstrong serves as the ultimate object lesson in the precarious reality of the jester's world. It demonstrated that no amount of wealth or perceived political clout could protect you when you finally shattered the illusion, and your words were judged not as the licensed folly of a fool, but as the genuine insolence of a subject. His story is a perfect dramatic capsule of the entire jester paradox. The same sharp tongue that built his empire was the very instrument that destroyed it. This seemingly supernatural ability to speak truth, often in a cryptic or roundabout way, leads us to one of the most enigmatic facets of the jester's legend, their uncanny connection to prophecy and the divine. In the medieval worldview, the line between madness and divine inspiration was often blurry. A person deemed a natural fool, whose mind operated outside the boundaries of conventional logic, was not always seen as simply broken or defective. Sometimes they were viewed as being touched by God, their perceived simplicity a sign that they had been stripped of worldly guile, making them a pure vessel for messages from a higher power. Their nonsense wasn't always just nonsense. It could be interpreted as a sacred code, a series of riddles sent from the heavens that only the wise or the destined could decipher. This belief transformed the Jester from a mere political commentator into a potential oracle, their chaotic performances taking on the aura of a seance where the future might be glimpsed through the veil of folly. We see this concept echoed in some of the most enduring literary traditions. While William Shakespeare was writing in the Elizabethan era, his fools frequently embody this prophetic quality, serving as truth-tellers whose madness is a mask for profound insight. In his tragedy King Lear, the character of the fool is arguably the most perceptive figure in the entire play. While the aged king descends into a genuine, destructive madness, having foolishly divided his kingdom, his fool remains his constant companion, peppering him with riddles, songs, and seemingly absurd pronouncements that all point directly to the catastrophic consequences of Lear's actions. At one point, the fool tells Lear, "Thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise." It's a devastatingly simple and accurate prophecy of the suffering to come, all the more powerful for being delivered by the character the court views as a simpleton. He isn't just commenting on events, he is forecasting the entire tragic arc of the play. His words a stark preview of the storm and the madness that will consume Lear. Shakespeare was tapping into a very old and deeply held cultural belief that the fool, precisely because he exists outside the normal social order, is granted a unique and painful clarity about the follies of that order. Moving from literature into the murkier waters of historical anecdote, we find stories that seem to confirm this mystical link. One persistent legend surrounds the Jester of King John of England, a monarch known for his tyranny and his tumultuous reign. As the story goes, the Jester, whose name is lost to time, was said to have openly mocked the king for his greed and his oppressive policies. In a moment of what seemed like pure, random absurdity, the Jester reportedly quipped that the king was like a donkey trying to wear a lion's crown, a ridiculous and feeble creature pretending to a strength it did not possess. At the time, it was likely dismissed as just another impertinent joke, but later generations, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, saw a chilling prediction in those words. King John's reign ultimately ended in crisis, culminating in his nobles forcing him to sign the Magna Carta, a document that severely limited his power. The image of the mighty king being brought low by his own barons gave the Jester's earlier donkey and lion analogy a prophetic weight. The seemingly foolish analogy was reinterpreted as a divine warning, a moment when the court jester, in his divinely sanctioned madness, had seen the true weakness of the king long before anyone else dared to acknowledge it. This perceived connection to the occult wasn't always passive. There are accounts suggesting that jesters were sometimes actively consulted as informal diviners, their chaotic actions scrutinized for omens. A jester choosing to sit at a particular nobleman's feet during a feast might be later seen as a sign of that lord's future rise to favor. A funny song that mentioned a specific animal or a far-off land could, after an event involving that animal or a messenger from that land, be reread as a premonition. Their performances were a kind of living, breathing scrying pool. The court watched them not just for laughs, but for glimpses of fate, their random movements and utterances providing a Rorschach test onto which the anxious and the ambitious could project their hopes and fears. This practice elevated the jester's role from entertainer to a central figure in the court's psychological and spiritual ecosystem. They became a walking, talking omen, their every action imbued with potential meaning, a constant, jingling reminder that the gods might be speaking, if only one knew how to listen through the laughter. Perhaps the most compelling way to understand this phenomenon is to see the jester as a human embodiment of the wild card. In a society rigidly structured by feudalism and divine right, where everyone had a fixed place, the fool was the one unpredictable element. They represented chaos itself, a controlled variable introduced into the highly controlled experiment of court life. And in a world that believed deeply in a divine plan, chaos was not necessarily random. It could be the visible hand of God working in mysterious ways. The Jester's sudden, inexplicable insight, their bizarrely accurate prediction, was the universe momentarily tipping its hand. It was a crack in the orderly facade of reality, and through that crack, people believed they could sometimes see the future. So, while we can rationally explain away these prophecies as clever observations later mythologized by hindsight, that misses the point of how they were experienced. For the medieval court, the Jester's prophecy was real. It was a terrifying and awe-inspiring reminder that even the most powerful king was subject to forces far beyond his control, and that the most important truths in the realm might not be whispered by a bishop or a general, but babbled by a fool in a belled cap. Yet even in the glittering heart of power, no amount of wit or cunning could hold back the tide of a true catastrophe. As the 14th century wore on, a shadow fell across all of Europe, a terror that respected no rank or title, the Black Death. This wasn't a political enemy that could be outmaneuvered or a rival court that could be undermined with a clever rhyme. This was a silent, invisible scourge that wiped out perhaps half the population, turning bustling cities into ghost towns and leaving the very foundations of society trembling. In the face of such unimaginable horror, where the church's prayers seemed to go unanswered and the king's armies were utterly powerless, what possible role could a court jester have? Their part became one of the most profound and psychologically complex in their long history, transforming from political players into essential guardians of the human spirit, using gallows humor as a fragile life raft in a sea of despair. Inside the castle walls, the atmosphere was one of sustained, suffocating dread. The court was a trapped community, its members unable to flee the plague any more than the peasants in the fields, yet forced to maintain a facade of royal normalcy. Every cough from a nobleman, every feverish glance from a lady-in-waiting could be a death sentence. It was in this pressure cooker of fear that the Jester's traditional license to mock death itself became a vital survival tool. Gallows humor, that dark and ironic comedy that arises in the most dire situations, became their primary currency. A jester might joke about the new fashion of long, pointed shoes, saying they were perfect for kicking aside the bodies in the street, or perform a skit where Death himself was portrayed as a bumbling, clumsy figure who kept tripping over his own robe and dropping his scythe. This kind of comedy was not callous, it was a critical psychological release. By making the unspeakable a subject of laughter, even for a moment, the jester gave the court permission to exhale. He allowed them to confront their terror in a controlled, communal setting, transforming paralyzing fear into a shared, manageable experience. His antics were a defiant scream into the void, a way of stating, "We are still here, we are still laughing, and we have not been entirely broken." Beyond this emotional triage, the jester almost certainly became a key node in the court's desperate information network. In an era of rampant superstition and wild rumors, reliable information was more precious than gold. The jester, with his unparalleled freedom of movement, could gather intelligence from the outside world that was too dangerous or too grim for official messengers to report directly to the king. He could venture into the stricken town, talk to the dying physicians and the frantic monks, and bring back a raw, unvarnished account of the plague's progress. But how to deliver such horrifying news without sending the entire court into a panic? His artistic skills became more crucial than ever. He might return and perform a sorrowful, allegorical ballad about a great storm, laying waste to a forest where the tallest oaks and the smallest saplings were falling alike. The king would understand the metaphor. The plague was striking nobles and commoners indiscriminately. Or the jester could be used for the opposite purpose, to spread deliberate misinformation to maintain order. If morale was collapsing, he might circulate a cheerful, hopeful tune about a miraculous well whose waters could ward off sickness, a fictional tale designed to calm a terrified populace and prevent a riot, even if the truth was far darker. This role placed the Jester in a uniquely precarious ethical position. He was now a purveyor of both stark truth and comforting lies, a balancing act that weighed heavily on the conscience. We can imagine a particularly thoughtful fool grappling with this dilemma. Was it his duty to make the court face the brutal reality, even if it meant deepening their despair? Or was his higher calling to provide whatever solace he could, even if it was built on a fiction? This internal conflict would have been a constant companion. Furthermore, the very nature of the plague challenged the foundation of his power. His license was granted by a monarch who derived authority from God. But what happened when God seemed to have abandoned the world, when divine right offered no protection from a random, agonizing death? The Jester's traditional role as a truth-teller to power risked becoming irrelevant when the powerful were as helpless as everyone else. In this new, terrifying world, his most important truth might have been a simple, human one, not a political barb or a coded warning, but a gesture of shared vulnerability, a moment of quiet companionship in the face of the inevitable. Ultimately, the Jesters who lived through the Black Death were navigating the complete unraveling of their world. Their performances were a desperate, courageous attempt to stitch a thread of normalcy and continuity into the fabric of a collapsing reality. By insisting on laughter in the shadow of the gallows, they affirmed a fundamental, resilient aspect of humanity. They reminded the court that even when kings, armies, and churches failed, the human capacity for humor, for connection, and for defiant joy could still flicker, a small but stubborn flame in the overwhelming darkness. Their service during the plague may have been their finest and most heartbreaking hour, proving that the greatest foolery of all was not to give in to despair. This profound demonstration of the human spirit in the face of annihilation forces us to reconsider the Jester's entire legacy, shifting our view from the political puppet master to a figure whose influence touched upon something far deeper and more universally human than mere court intrigue. So with all this talk of secret codes and whispered warnings, of a unique profession practiced in the gilded cages of Europe's most dangerous courts, a fascinating question arises: were these solo operators truly alone? Did the Jester, isolated by his motley and his perilous position, have anyone he could truly trust? The answer may lie in the shadows of a different kind of institution, one far less formal than a stonemason's guild, but perhaps just as vital, a secret society of fools. While history holds no charters or meeting minutes for a Jester's guild, the very nature of their work and the scattered clues they left behind strongly suggest the existence of a vast, informal, and deeply secretive network that connected these individuals across kingdoms and generations. Think about the immense specialized knowledge required to survive in their role. This wasn't just a matter of learning a few jokes, it was about mastering a complete system of survival. A young man or woman newly recruited to a duke's court would need to understand the unspoken rules of the Jester's license, the subtle art of reading a monarch's mood, and the dangerous dance of coded communication. How would they learn this? It's highly unlikely they were expected to figure it all out on their own, with their life as the price for a single mistake. It is far more plausible that an established Jester took on an apprentice, not just to teach them juggling and tumbling, but to initiate them into the hidden curriculum of their craft. This would have been an oral tradition, passed down in strict confidence, covering everything from which nobles had violent tempers to the specific metaphors understood in a rival king's court. This master-apprentice relationship was the bedrock of the network, ensuring that the most critical secrets, the ones that kept a fool alive, were preserved and passed on. Beyond this one-on-one teaching, the evidence points to a wider web of communication. Jesters traveled. They accompanied their patrons on diplomatic missions, royal progresses, and military campaigns. When two courts met, the jesters would undoubtedly have found time to converse away from prying ears. In these hushed meetings, they could exchange the most valuable currency they possessed, information. One jester might warn another about a certain prince in a neighboring realm who had a nasty habit of executing entertainers who offended him. Another could share a brilliant new piece of political satire that had landed perfectly, or a clever gesture that had successfully signaled danger to their king. They might even have developed their own cant or slang, a fool's lexicon, to discuss their trade without being understood by the nobles and servants around them. This network acted as an early warning system and a professional support group, a way for these isolated individuals to know they were not entirely alone in their strange and treacherous world. We can even see hints of this fraternity in the rare historical records that mention them. When a beloved jester like King Henry VIII's Will Somers died, his passing was noted not just in his own court, but was remarked upon by writers and commentators elsewhere, suggesting his fame and reputation had traveled through these professional channels. Furthermore, the remarkable consistency in the jester's role, costume, and perceived privileges across different cultures and centuries from England to France to the Holy Roman Empire hints at a shared, transmitted body of knowledge. The concept of the bauble as a mock scepter, the protection of the coxcomb, the understanding that truth could be spoken in jest, these were not independently invented in every single castle. They were a professional culture, and cultures are sustained by communication, by shared stories, and by a sense of common identity. The jesters of Europe, though they served rival masters, were all practitioners of the same mysterious and dangerous art, and it is almost unthinkable that they did not, in some way, look out for one another. This hidden fraternity adds yet another layer of depth to our understanding of the court jester. He was not just a lone wolf relying on his wits, but part of a silent, dispersed guild whose members recognized each other by the bells they wore and the dangerous truths they told. This network was his true university, his intelligence agency, and his insurance policy. It was what transformed a potentially short and brutal career into a tradition that could endure for centuries, safeguarding not just the lives of individual fools, but the very secrets of their impossible profession. While the image of the male jester is etched into our cultural memory, history holds far quieter yet equally compelling stories of women who wore the motley. The female fool, or fooless as they were sometimes called, occupied a role that was exponentially rarer and in many ways far more treacherous to navigate. In a world where women had severely limited power and agency, a woman who stepped into the spotlight to mock and critique the most powerful men of her era was playing a game with the highest possible stakes. Her very presence was a paradox, a walking contradiction of medieval social norms, and this made her position uniquely dangerous and her survival all the more remarkable. To be a female jester was to be doubly an outsider, first for her profession and second for her gender, and this dual status required a level of cunning and social intelligence that defies imagination. Consider the societal landscape. A noblewoman's value was often tied to her silence, her piety, and her role as a diplomatic asset in a political marriage. A female fool shattered this ideal completely. She was loud, public, and subversive. Her humor couldn't simply be the boisterous, physical comedy of her male counterparts. It had to be crafted with surgical precision. She operated in a space with no rulebook, navigating the predatory attention of powerful men while simultaneously using her wit as a shield against it. A male jester might be beaten for an insult. A female jester risked far worse, including sexual violence or being permanently branded as a woman of loose morals, a stain that could destroy her even if she escaped official punishment. Her license was more fragile, her margin for error infinitesimally small. Every joke was a calculated risk, balancing the need to entertain against the peril of offending not just a king's politics, but his masculinity. This is where the enigmatic figure of Jane Fool in the court of Henry VIII becomes so illuminating. As we touched on before, Jane was a natural fool in the service of Queen Catherine Parr. Her case is a perfect window into the complex dynamics of protection and vulnerability. Jane was not just a court entertainer, she was part of the Queen's household, a dependent. This relationship was likely her greatest source of safety. Queen Catherine, an exceptionally intelligent and compassionate woman, would have provided a buffer between Jane and the more volatile elements of the court, particularly the king himself. Under the Queen's wing, Jane's folly was contained and given a purpose: to provide innocent companionship and amusement within the female-dominated sphere of the Queen's chambers. This was a common and often safer niche for female fools. They frequently served queens and noblewomen, where their humor could be more relational and less politically explosive, their audience more understanding of the nuances of their performance. But to assume this made their role simple or safe would be a profound mistake. Even within this protected space, a woman like Jane Fool was navigating a minefield. The Tudor court of Henry VIII was a cauldron of sexual politics, religious fervor, and paranoid intrigue. A misinterpreted gesture or an ill-timed remark from a female fool, even in the Queen's apartments, could have cascading consequences. If Jane's natural state led her to blurt out an uncomfortable truth about the king's deteriorating health or his relationship with a courtier, the fallout could have jeopardized not only her own safety but that of her patron, Queen Catherine. The female fool's loyalty was therefore a matter of life and death in a very direct way. Her survival was inextricably linked to the status and security of the woman she served. When a queen fell from favor, as so many of Henry's wives did, her entire household was dispersed, their protectors gone. For a dependent fooless, this could mean being cast out into a world with no safety net, her unique talents now a liability rather than a shield. Beyond the English court, traces of other formidable women emerge from the historical record, hinting at the varied forms this role could take. In 16th century Italy, a woman known as Madalena the Fool was renowned in the Ferrers court not for physical antics but for her dazzling wit and improvised poetry. Her humor was intellectual, a rapier thrust compared to the club of a physical comedian. She engaged in verbal duels with nobles and diplomats, her sharp tongue a recognized and feared instrument. To hold her own in such an environment, Madalena would have needed an impeccable understanding of current events, philosophy, and the complex web of alliances that defined Italian politics. Her success demonstrates that the fooless was not always a passive, natural, but could be a highly educated and intentional performer, using her intellect to carve out a space for herself in a rigidly patriarchal world. Her story suggests that for some women, the motley was not a cage but a platform, one of the only avenues available for a woman to publicly showcase her intelligence and sway opinion. The legacy of the female fool is therefore one of profound complexity. They were simultaneously protected and exposed, cherished and vulnerable. Figures like Jane Fool and Madalena the Fool force us to expand our definition of the jester's power. It wasn't always about publicly correcting a king. Sometimes it was about the subtle influence wielded in a queen's chambers, the quiet comfort provided to an isolated royal woman, or the intellectual victory scored in a poetic contest. Their game was indeed more dangerous, played on a tighter rope with a much thinner safety net. They remind us that courage in the medieval court came in many forms, and for a woman to make a living and a life through laughter required a kind of bravery we are only just beginning to understand. This extraordinary access and carefully coded communication system we've explored also created a terrifying possibility, one that would haunt the dreams of any paranoid ruler. What if the person you trusted to be your court's emotional barometer and secret spy was in fact a master of deception working against you? For all the loyalty of a Will Sommers, history and legend whisper of a darker archetype, the jester as a vengeful turncoat, a wolf in motley who used the unique privileges of the fool to orchestrate their patron's ruin from within the inner sanctum. This wasn't merely about a joke that went too far. This was about a sustained, secret campaign of psychological sabotage, where the bauble became a weapon and laughter itself a poison. Consider the mindset of a jester recruited from a conquered people, a nobleman captured in a bitter war, forced into the motley as the ultimate humiliation, might outwardly play the compliant fool while inwardly nurturing a deep and patient hatred. His entire performance becomes a long con. Every laugh he elicits from the court that subjugated him is a lie. Every song he sings is a mask. His goals shift from entertainment and survival to a cold, calculated revenge. This kind of jester wouldn't need to wield a dagger. His wit was far more lethal. He could spend years subtly warping the king's perception, using his license to plant seeds of doubt about loyal advisors. A seemingly innocent joke about a certain duke's newfound wealth could suggest corruption. A playful pantomime of two nobles whispering together could imply conspiracy. The jester's genius lay in making these insinuations feel like spontaneous observations, the impulsive thoughts of a simple mind rather than the deliberate accusations of a rival. He was psychologically gaslighting a monarch, slowly and methodically turning the king against his own support structure, all while maintaining the cheerful, bumbling facade of the trusted fool. One of the most persistent legends of such a turncoat involves a jester serving the English king, Edward II, a monarch whose reign was plagued by rebellion and internal strife. The story tells of a fool who was secretly in the pay of the king's enemies, particularly his estranged queen, Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. This jester's role was not to kill the king, but to dismantle his spirit and his credibility. He would use his performances to publicly mock Edward's weaknesses, not with the gentle chiding of a loyal fool, but with a cruel, undermining ridicule designed to erode the king's confidence and the court's respect for him. He might joke about the king's preferences for farming and ditch digging over military pursuits, framing them not as eccentric hobbies but as signs of an unfit ruler. At the same time, he could use his mobility to carry secret messages between the conspirators, his jester's costume making him an unsuspected courier in the very heart of the royal household. When Edward was eventually deposed and met a brutal, infamous death, the legend suggests the jester's whispered barbs and intelligence gathering had played a crucial, if unrecorded, part in softening him up for the fall, proving that a well-placed word could be as effective as an army in bringing down a king. Beyond these grand legends of regime change, there were more personal, intimate forms of revenge available to a disgruntled fool. A jester who felt wronged, perhaps passed over for a reward or publicly shamed by his master, had a vast arsenal for retaliation. He could become a master of the carefully timed, reputation-damaging rumor. At a crowded feast, he might sidle up to a foreign ambassador and, under the guise of sharing a funny story, let slip a damaging piece of gossip about the king's health or the kingdom's finances, knowing the information would spread. He could sabotage diplomatic moments with a perfectly timed, inappropriate jest that offended a crucial ally, later claiming it was just a foolish mistake. The most insidious revenge of all was psychological. A jester privy to a monarch's deepest insecurities and private fears could weaponize that knowledge. He might work references to those fears into his routines, not to help the king confront them as a loyal fool might, but to endlessly poke at the wound, keeping the monarch in a state of anxiety and self-doubt. This was a revenge that left no physical marks but could cripple a ruler's ability to lead, all while the jester stood safely behind the impenetrable shield of his own perceived irrelevance. The ultimate power of the turncoat jester, however, lay in the perfect ambiguity of his actions. How could a king ever prove treason when the evidence was all just jokes? If a loyal jester's warning was hidden in a metaphor, how could you distinguish it from a disloyal jester's sabotage which would use the very same method? This created a paralyzing paradox for the ruler. To distrust the jester was to lose a vital source of intelligence and emotional release. To trust him blindly was to potentially harbor a viper at the breast. The fear of the turncoat, then, may have been as powerful as the turncoat himself. It meant the monarch lived in a hall of mirrors where every laugh from his fool might be genuine, or it might be the triumphant chuckle of a secret enemy who had just successfully planted a lie that would someday topple a throne. This constant, low-grade paranoia was perhaps the Jester's most profound and unintended revenge, turning the one person meant to be a source of clarity and truth into the greatest source of doubt. This constant high-wire act, this dance on the razor's edge between celebrated wit and condemned traitor, naturally leads to a deeper, more intriguing question. With the stakes so impossibly high, how did any of them survive for more than a few weeks? Were they simply relying on raw, individual talent and sheer luck, or was there something more systematic at play, a hidden framework that guided their every move? Given the remarkable consistency of the Jester's role across different courts and centuries, it is almost impossible not to speculate about the existence of a deeply ingrained, unwritten ethical code, a secret rulebook for survival passed down through the silent fraternity of fools. This wasn't a formal document you could find in a royal library. It was a living, breathing set of principles etched into the psyche of every successful jester, governing what they could do, what they must never do, and where the final, uncrossable lines were drawn. At the heart of this hypothetical code would have been one supreme, non-negotiable commandment: protect the source of your power, but know its limits. In practical terms, this meant the Jester's first duty was to the monarch who granted him his license. While his job was to critique and mock, the ultimate goal of that mockery was never to truly destabilize the throne or inspire genuine rebellion. A joke that undermined a specific policy was one thing. A joke that questioned the king's divine right to rule was tantamount to suicide. The code would have dictated that the monarch's fundamental authority was the bedrock upon which the Jester's own fragile freedom was built. To chip away at that foundation was to saw off the very branch he was sitting on. This explains why the most successful jesters, like Tribulet or Will Sommers, always framed their criticisms within the context of a loyal subject trying to guide a flawed but legitimate ruler. Their barbs were corrective, not destructive. They might mock the king's new tax, but they would never mock the concept of the king's right to tax. This subtle distinction was the difference between a useful truth-teller and a treasonous agitator, and understanding it was the first lesson in the Jester's unwritten curriculum. But this loyalty to the crown had a crucial, humanizing corollary within the code, a profound, often unspoken duty to protect the truly vulnerable within the castle walls. While a jester might ruthlessly tease a powerful duke or a scheming bishop, historical anecdotes suggest they often drew a firm ethical line at targeting the monarch's young children or their more gentle, powerless consorts. These individuals, often trapped in the same gilded cage as the jester but with even less agency, represented a sphere of innocence or powerlessness that was considered off-limits. To use his sharp wit against a child heir or a kind-hearted queen would have been seen not just as poor form, but as a violation of the jester's deeper purpose. His role was to puncture the arrogance of the powerful, not to torment the helpless. There are stories, for instance, of jesters using their antics to distract and comfort young princes and princesses during frightening court ceremonies or times of political turmoil. In these moments, the jester shed his role as a political commentator and became a guardian of childhood, a rare figure who could bridge the vast social gap to offer genuine, unthreatening companionship. This protective instinct wasn't just about morality, it was also about strategic survival. The children of today were the patrons of tomorrow. A jester known for his cruelty to a young royal would find himself with a very short and unpleasant career once that child ascended the throne. Furthermore, this unwritten rulebook almost certainly contained strict guidelines about the most volatile topic of all, the succession. In any monarchy, the question of who would inherit the crown was a powder keg surrounded by lit matches. A jester wading into these waters with a careless joke was begging for an explosion. The code would have strictly forbade openly favoring one potential heir over another, or making jokes that questioned the legitimacy of a royal birth. To do so was to immediately align oneself with a faction, and factionalism was the death of the jester's perceived neutrality. Once he was seen as a partisan for Duke A against Duke B, his value as an impartial truth-teller evaporated, and he became just another weapon in their political war, a weapon that could be easily discarded once the conflict was over. The wise jester knew that his survival depended on serving the crown as an institution, not the individual contenders for it. He might use his coded language to warn the current king about a particular heir's reckless friends or dangerous ambitions, but he would never perform a skit that outright mocked the heir's claim to the throne. That was a line that, once crossed, led directly to the executioner's block, as it struck at the most sensitive and dangerous nerve in the entire body politic. This intricate set of rules extended beyond mere survival and into the realm of professional honor. While jesters were masters of deception in their espionage, there likely existed a strong ethical prohibition against using their talents for purely malicious personal gain at the expense of the completely innocent. Spreading a vicious, unfounded rumor about a virtuous lady in waiting simply for a rival's payment, or framing a loyal, low-ranking knight for a crime he didn't commit, these actions would have been seen as a corruption of the jester's art. His power was meant to be a scalpel, not a club. Using it to destroy someone who posed no threat to the realm's stability or the king's safety would have been a gross violation of the tacit trust the entire court placed in the role. It would have transformed him from a necessary, licensed fool into a common, despicable slanderer, and the court's laughter would have curdled into fear and contempt. A jester who lost the court's willingness to laugh with him, even nervously, was a jester who had lost everything. His effectiveness and his life depended on maintaining a baseline of goodwill, and that required a certain baseline of ethical conduct, however strangely defined it might have been by the brutal standards of the time. Ultimately, the jester's unwritten code was a masterpiece of situational ethics, a fluid and dynamic guide for navigating an impossibly complex social landscape. It wasn't about being a purely good person in a modern sense. It was about being an effective and long-lived jester. It balanced audacity with restraint, loyalty with honesty, and power with protection. This hidden rulebook allowed them to be both the court's conscience and its courtier, its truth-teller and its trickster. It was the internal compass that guided them through the storm of court politics, ensuring that their unique, perilous, and vital profession could endure for centuries, not as a chaotic free-for-all, but as a disciplined, mysterious, and essential art form. Understanding the jokes that echoed through medieval halls requires us to discard our modern sense of humor and step into a world where laughter was a weapon, a shield, and a sophisticated intellectual puzzle. The jester's routine was a carefully engineered rhetorical device, a piece of performance art designed to operate on at least two distinct levels simultaneously. For the common soldiers and servants in the back of the Great Hall, the humor was broad, physical, and immediately accessible. A pratfall, a silly face, a juggling trick that ended with all the apples tumbling to the floor. This was the surface-level gag that ensured universal laughter and established the jester's identity as a harmless fool. But layered directly on top of this simple foundation was a second, far more potent level of meaning. A satirical commentary crafted specifically for the nobility, the clergy, and the monarch seated on the dais. This dual-layer structure was the core of the jester's power, allowing him to deliver a devastating political critique to the people who needed to hear it, all while wrapping it in the protective packaging of a lowbrow comedy that amused everyone else. This sophisticated approach often relied on allegory and anthropomorphism, turning the animal kingdom and the rustic world into a stage for courtly drama. A jester might launch into a fable about a prideful lion who refused to listen to his fellow animals, only to find his mane caught in a thorn bush, leaving him helpless. To the kitchen staff, it's a simple, funny story about a silly animal. But for the barons and the king, the message is crystal clear. The lion is the monarch, the thorns are the stubborn policies he refuses to change, and his helplessness is a direct warning about the consequences of arrogance and ignoring wise counsel. The Jester wasn't just telling a story, he was building a parallel universe where the king's most trusted advisor could be a scheming fox, and a disgruntled duke could be portrayed as a stubborn old goat, all under the safe and unassailable guise of childish fantasy. This method allowed him to critique specific individuals and policies without ever naming them, providing plausible deniability while ensuring his intended audience understood the pointed message perfectly. Another vital tool in the Jester's rhetorical arsenal was the parody of sacred or formal texts. In a society where the Latin Mass and chivalric romances were pillars of cultural authority, mimicking their structure for comedic effect was a shocking and powerful subversion. A jester could recite a prayer but replace the holy words with a litany of complaints about the castle's terrible food. He could perform a mock knighting ceremony, dubbing a chicken, Sir Cluxalot, as a commentary on a nobleman who had bought his title rather than earning it through valor. This kind of humor was deeply resonant because it played with the most familiar and revered structures of medieval life. For the uneducated, the mere sound of a Latin prayer being mangled was funny. For the educated elite, the humor came from the brilliant and blasphemous juxtaposition, using the form of something sacred to highlight something profane or corrupt within their own court. It was a way of questioning authority without directly challenging it, using the establishment's own language and rituals to gently, or sometimes not so gently, mock its failings. The sheer intellectual dexterity required for this cannot be overstated. A successful jester had to be a master of current events, theology, law, and poetry. He needed to know the key players in every political dispute, the theological debates raging through the church, and the latest gossip from foreign courts. His mind was a constantly updating database of potential material. When a new tax was announced, he didn't just complain about it. He devised a complex skit about a greedy badger hoarding nuts, a performance that would be understood by the taxed merchants and the taxing king in two completely different, yet equally potent ways. This mental agility was his primary survival mechanism. He had to read the room in an instant, sensing when a joke that worked yesterday would be dangerous today because two nobles had secretly reconciled overnight. He had to know when to push a point and when to retreat into pure physical comedy, his mind constantly calculating the political temperature and adjusting his performance accordingly to ensure his message was heard without getting him killed. This was not a profession for a simpleton. It was a career for a political scientist, a psychologist, and a poet, all trapped inside the costume of a clown. While we often picture them confined to glittering throne rooms and bustling great halls, the jester's license to roam extended far beyond the castle walls, all the way to the muddy, blood-soaked front lines of medieval warfare. It's a jarring image, the colorful, belled figure amidst armored knights and stoic men at arms, but the presence of a fool on a military campaign was a calculated and surprisingly common strategic decision. Far from being a frivolous luxury, the jester transformed into a multi-purpose military asset, a psychological operations officer long before the term was ever coined. Their primary battlefield function was, unsurprisingly, the maintenance of morale among troops facing the grim realities of siege, march, and the terror of impending battle. After days of marching in heavy armor with poor rations and the constant fear of ambush, the spirit of an army could crumble faster than its formations. The jester was a living, breathing antidote to this despair. Around the campfire at night, he would perform not for a king, but for hundreds of common soldiers, using his same bag of tricks, songs, physical comedy, and satirical jabs to temporarily lift the crushing weight of their circumstances. By mocking the enemy commander, turning the day's hardships into a shared joke, or simply providing a moment of genuine, unthinking laughter, the Jester reforged the bonds of camaraderie and reminded these men of their shared humanity, a potent weapon against the dehumanizing grind of war. This morale-boosting role had a direct and practical military benefit. A general leading a demoralized, sullen army is commanding a blunt instrument at best and a mutinous rabble at worst. The Jester's ability to unify the troops through laughter and shared experience was a direct contributor to unit cohesion and, by extension, battlefield effectiveness. But his utility stretched far beyond mere entertainment. The Jester's most daring and dangerous wartime role was that of a messenger and scout. In the chaotic and fluid environment of a campaign, communication between different wings of an army or between a besieging force and a relief column was perilous. A standard messenger, clearly identifiable as a man-at-arms, could be easily captured or killed. The Jester, however, presented a unique solution. His motley costume, so out of place on a battlefield, was his greatest camouflage. He could approach enemy positions under the guise of being a lost, harmless simpleton, a wandering entertainer separated from his lord's retinue. This non-threatening appearance allowed him to observe enemy troop numbers, dispositions, and fortifications from a dangerously close range, gathering intelligence that would be impossible for a scout in chainmail to acquire. Furthermore, if captured, the Jester operated under a different set of rules than a soldier. The medieval code of chivalry, however inconsistently applied, often offered some protection to non-combatants, and the fool's perceived insignificance could be his get-out-of-jail-free card. An enemy lord might detain a common Jester for a time, but executing him would be seen as a mark of dishonor, an act of cruelty against a defenseless fool. This perceived immunity made Jesters ideal for carrying sensitive messages through contested territory. They could memorize intricate verbal commands or, as with their hollow baubles, carry small, hidden written notes. A Jester tumbling through no man's land might be seen as a bizarre curiosity, but in reality he was a living courier, his antics a carefully staged performance to deliver a vital piece of information right under the enemy's nose. This dual function, lifting the spirits of friends while spying on foes, made the Jester a uniquely versatile and unpredictable element in medieval military doctrine, a testament to the medieval mind's ability to see strategic value in the most unconventional of places. This brings us to a haunting and often overlooked question, one that lies at the very heart of their mystery. What became of a Jester's power when the man or woman inside the motley finally fell silent? In a profession built on secrets, where a lifetime of accumulated insights and coded languages was more valuable than any crown jewel, the end of a Jester's career represented a moment of profound vulnerability. The court, after all, was an institution designed for continuity. Kings died, but the monarchy endured. The Jester, however, was a singular phenomenon. His unique blend of psychological insight, political acumen, and performative genius was not a title that could be simply bestowed upon a successor by royal decree. When a great fool died, did his dangerous knowledge die with him, vanishing into the ether like the echo of a final laugh? Or was there a secret succession, a quiet passing of the bauble from one generation to the next, ensuring that the tradition of licensed truth-telling would never truly be extinguished? The most plausible and compelling answer is that the Jester's craft was sustained through a master-apprentice system, an oral tradition so clandestine it left almost no trace in the official record. Think of the immense, specialized knowledge a new Jester needed to survive. He couldn't just walk into court and start insulting dukes. He had to learn the hidden curriculum. An established fool, sensing his own advancing age or declining health, would have sought out a protege, a young minstrel with a sharp tongue, a clever acrobat, or even the intelligent child of a servant who showed a precocious lack of fear. This wasn't a formal education, it was an initiation. The master would teach the apprentice the unspoken rules, which baron had a murderous temper, which bishop could not be mocked, the precise metaphor the current king understood for treason, and the intricate hand signals used to warn of a spy in the room. This knowledge was the jester's true inheritance, more valuable than any wage. The apprentice learned to read the subtle flicker in a monarch's eye that separated genuine amusement from concealed rage. He was taught the archive of satirical songs and allegorical fables that could be adapted for any political crisis. This was a direct transmission of power, ensuring that the secret society of fools maintained its collective intelligence across generations, its members connected not by blood, but by the shared, perilous understanding of how to speak truth while wearing a smile. Yet for many jesters, there was no clean succession, and their legacy evaporated the moment they drew their last breath. This was especially true for the natural fools, those individuals whose value was tied to their unique persona and perceived innate simplicity. Their appeal was irreplaceable. You couldn't train someone to be a different kind of human curiosity. That specific combination of innocence and accidental wisdom was a one-time phenomenon. When such a fool died, the role often died with them, their unique perspective lost forever. Even for the licensed professionals, a sudden death from plague or an unexpected execution could sever the chain of knowledge transmission completely. All the delicate understandings built up over decades, the king's personal insecurities, the hidden alliances between noble families, the secret meanings behind certain courtly rituals, would vanish in an instant. The new jester, if one was appointed, would have to start from scratch, relearning the court's dangerous landscape through trial and error, a process that could, and often did, prove fatal. This fragility underscores the true ephemerality of their influence. It was a personal authority, woven from the specific relationship between one fool and one monarch, and it rarely survived the passing of either. The historical record itself reflects this transience. For every Will Sommers or Tribulate, whose names echo through chronicles and legends, there are countless jesters who are nothing more than a single line in a household account book, payment to John the Fool for his services, or a faded face in the corner of a royal portrait. We know they existed, but their voices, their jokes, their secret triumphs and private fears are gone. They left no memoirs. To write down their secrets would be to destroy the protective ambiguity that kept them alive. Their art was one of the moment, a performance that lived and died in the air of the Great Hall. This creates a vast and silent void in our understanding. We can piece together their political role from the consequences of their actions, but the intimate texture of their daily lives, the quiet conversations with their potential apprentices, the private doubts they harbored, these are the true lost histories of the medieval court. The jesters who failed to pass on their knowledge took their world with them, leaving us with only the outline of their motley and the ghost of their laughter. This contemplation of an ending forces a final, grand assessment of their paradoxical legacy. The court jester was a magnificent, impossible contradiction. He was the most powerful, powerless person in the realm. He could topple a duke with a rhyme but owned no land. He could chastise a king and live, yet he could be dismissed and destitute with a single wave of a royal hand. His influence was immense but intangible. He shaped policy with a joke and averted wars with a pantomime, yet he commanded no armies and passed no laws. He was the ultimate insider who was forever an outsider, welcomed into the most intimate chambers precisely because his motley ensured he would never truly belong. This constant state of in-between, of being both central and marginal, is what made him so effective and so psychologically isolated. He was a living key that could unlock any door in the castle, yet he himself had no door to call his own. Perhaps their most profound and enduring legacy is the timeless archetype they embodied, the truth-teller in disguise. From the wise fools in Shakespeare's plays to the cynical comedians of the modern age who hold power to account, the spirit of the jester lives on. They established the potent idea that the most dangerous and necessary truths often must be smuggled into the room under the cover of laughter, that satire can be a more effective weapon than a sword, and that the person everyone underestimates is often the one seeing the situation with the clearest eyes. They proved that courage comes in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is to tell a king he is naked, so long as you do it with a clever enough turn of phrase to keep your head attached to your shoulders. The medieval court is long gone, its throne rooms now museums, and its intrigues the stuff of history books. But the jester's lesson that humor, intelligence, and moral courage can be fused into a tool for survival and change is as vital today as it was 1,000 years ago. They remind us that the fool is not the one who asks the silly question, but often the one who is wise enough to speak the truth that everyone else is too frightened to utter. But for all the tales of clever truth-tellers and loyal confidants, there lies a far more unsettling side to this history, a shadowy corner of the jester's world where the motley was not a shield for courage but a cloak for malice. We must confront the uncomfortable reality that the very privileges that allowed a good-hearted fool to speak wisdom also empowered a cruel one to indulge his darkest impulses without consequence. The license that protected satire could just as easily shelter sadism, and the intimate access granted to a trusted entertainer could be weaponized by a soul who found joy in the suffering of others. These were the dark jesters, individuals who used their unique position not to guide or heal, but to manipulate, torment, and enrich themselves from the misery they helped to create. Perhaps the most chilling archetype is the jester who became the loyal enforcer for a tyrant. In these dreadful partnerships, the fool transformed from a check on power into its most zealous and creative amplifier. While the king or duke wielded the blunt force of law and punishment, his jester provided the psychological warfare, a relentless campaign of humiliation and fear designed to break the spirits of the courtiers and commoners alike. This jester didn't just mock folly, he actively sought out and exposed the vulnerabilities of others for his master's amusement and his own. He would hound a nobleman known to be in debt, crafting song after song about his empty coffers until the man was a social pariah. He might focus his cruelest barbs on those who could not fight back, an elderly lord with a trembling hand, a foreign dignitary struggling with the language, or a gentle soul who simply wished to remain unnoticed. His laughter was a weapon, and the court's forced, nervous chuckles were the sound of a community living in terror, understanding that they were all potential targets in the tyrant's cruel game, with the jester acting as the gleeful ringmaster. The historical record offers some stark examples that blur the line between legend and grim fact. One of the most notorious figures is Perkio, the jester of Prince Charles III Philip of the Palatinate in the 18th century. While later romanticized as a jovial, hard-drinking character, older accounts paint a much darker picture. Perkio was entrusted by the prince with the keys to the enormous wine cellar in Heidelberg Castle. He wielded this authority with absolute, sadistic power. The stories claim he would force visitors and courtiers to drink staggering amounts of wine under the threat of imprisonment, finding humor in their resulting illness and humiliation. His small stature and jester's role belied a tyrannical control over a vital resource, and he seemed to relish the power he held to degrade others. His is a classic case of the petty tyrant, a jester whose license allowed him to inflict misery on a personal, intimate level, all under the pretense of boisterous fun, his cruelty sanctioned by a ruler who appreciated his ruthless efficiency and lack of scruples. Even more disturbing is the legend of the jester Kunz von der Rosen, who served the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I. The tales surrounding Kunz are complex, but they contain a thread of shocking brutality. In one account, during a siege, Kunz grew frustrated with the slow progress of the army sappers who were tunneling under the enemy walls. To motivate them, he reportedly descended into the dark, cramped tunnel and, wielding a whip, literally drove the men forward, lashing them as they worked in terror. This image is a far cry from the gentle fool comforting a child. It is the picture of a jester acting as a brutal overseer, using fear and physical pain to achieve his master's military goals. His motley, in that moment, was not a symbol of protected speech but a perverse uniform of authority, a signal that the emperor's fool had the power to command and punish, his traditional role twisted into something monstrous. Beyond these historical whispers, the darker impulses of the jester archetype found a powerful expression in literature, most notably in the character of Rigolto from Giuseppe Verdi's famous opera. While a fictional creation, Rigolto is a profound psychological study of a dark jester. He is a hunchbacked court jester whose entire life is consumed by bitterness and rage. He uses his wit not as a subtle tool, but as a razor-sharp scalpel to mercilessly eviscerate the courtiers around him, taking a vicious pleasure in their pain. He is despised by the nobility, but protected by the duke, who enjoys the cruel entertainment. Rigolto's tragedy is that his own malicious actions set in motion the events that lead to the destruction of the one pure thing in his life, his beloved daughter. His story is a terrifying exploration of how a lifetime of wielding licensed cruelty can poison the soul, turning a man into the very monster he pretends to be for his act. Rigolto is the dark jester's fate realized, a man so consumed by his role as a purveyor of pain that he ultimately engineers his own profound personal devastation. What could drive a person to embrace such a sinister path? The motivations were likely as varied as the individuals themselves. For some, it was simple opportunism. The court was a marketplace of influence, and a jester with no moral compass could amass significant wealth and power by becoming a tyrant's favorite. He could extort bribes from courtiers desperate to avoid his mockery, or receive lavish rewards for successfully destroying a rival of the crown. For others, it was a deep-seated psychological corruption. A person who had themselves been a victim of cruelty, a prisoner of war forced into the motley, or someone mocked for a physical deformity from birth might eventually internalize that hatred and, when given a sliver of power, unleash it upon others with a vengeance. The jester's license became their permission slip to repay a lifetime of suffering onto the world, their laughter a mask for a profound and festering resentment. They discovered that in a world of absolute power, there was a high demand for someone willing to be the designated tormentor, to do the dirty work of humiliation that a king could not be seen to do himself. This darker aspect forces us to abandon any simplistic, romanticized view of the court fool. The same system that produced a wise tribulet could also produce a vicious Perkio. The privileges of the bauble and the coxcomb were morally neutral. They were a tool, and like any powerful tool, they could be used to build up or to tear down, to speak truth or to spread venom. The presence of these dark jesters adds a necessary and chilling layer of moral complexity to the archetype. It reminds us that the freedom to speak without fear of consequence does not automatically lead to wisdom or goodness. Sometimes it simply provides a stage for the worst aspects of human nature, our capacity for cruelty, our thirst for power, and our willingness to sacrifice others for our own amusement and gain. The court jester, in the end, was a mirror reflecting the entire spectrum of humanity, from the courageous and compassionate to the cunning and the outright evil, all jingling together in the same chaotic, colorful, and deeply dangerous dance. But for all the jesters who mastered the art of survival, for those who navigated the razor's edge for decades, there were others whose stories ended not with a peaceful retirement, but with a chilling, abrupt silence. The court records simply stop mentioning them. The household accounts no longer list their wages. They vanish from the tapestry of court life as if they were never there, leaving behind a void often filled with unsettling questions. The very nature of their profession, holders of the most volatile secrets, observers of every hidden sin, made them walking liabilities. And when a liability becomes too great, the most efficient solution for any power structure is to make it disappear. This leads us into the shadowy, true crime corner of Jester history, where the final performance was not a jig or a song, but a mysterious death or a sudden, permanent vanishing act. Consider the precarious position of a jester who had served a king for 20 or 30 years. Over that time, he had become a living archive of state secrets. He knew which duke had been bribed by a foreign power, which bishop had illegitimate children, and perhaps most dangerously, the true circumstances behind a monarch's rise to power. The usurpations, the betrayals, the covert murders smoothed over by official propaganda. When that king neared the end of his life, the jester's knowledge transformed from an asset into a catastrophic threat to the incoming regime. A new king, especially one who had seized the throne through questionable means, could not afford to have a garrulous, licensed truth-teller wandering the halls, privy to the foundational lies upon which his authority was built. The most convenient and quietest way to handle this was not a public trial for treason, which would only draw attention to the very secrets they wanted buried. It was a discreet retirement. A jester might be given a generous purse of gold and a small cottage far from court, with the unspoken understanding that he was never to speak of what he knew. But how many of these retirees actually enjoyed their golden years? Chroniclers are often suspiciously silent. It is far more likely that many were simply assassinated on the road to their new home, their deaths written off as a robbery by bandits or a tragic accident. Their silence was purchased not with gold, but with a dagger in the dark. Then there are the cases that hint at something even more sinister than a simple silencing, the disappearances that seem directly tied to a single, explosive piece of knowledge. The legend of the jester in the court of a certain Eastern European prince is a haunting example. As the story goes, the prince was secretly practicing a forbidden, heretical form of worship, a fact he managed to conceal from the church and his own court. His jester, however, with his license to enter any room at any time, stumbled upon the prince in the midst of one of these illicit rituals. The jester, perhaps foolishly believing his license made him invulnerable, made a veiled joke about it during a public performance. He didn't name the prince directly, but the illusion was clear enough for those in the know. The very next day, the jester was gone. No announcement was made. His belongings were removed from his chamber. When asked, court officials would only shrug and say he had likely run away. But the other servants whispered of a covered cart being seen leaving the castle dungeons in the dead of night, headed for the deep, unmapped forest. In this scenario, the jester wasn't just a general repository of secrets. He was a man who knew one specific, kingdom-shattering truth, and for that he had to be erased completely, his very existence wiped from the court's memory. Sometimes the mystery is not in the disappearance itself, but in the bizarre and inexplicable circumstances surrounding a jester's death. Official records might state that a fool died from a sudden, violent fever or from a fall down a staircase. But the unofficial stories passed down through servant gossip and local folklore tell a different tale. There is the chilling account of a jester in a minor German court who was found dead in the castle's aviary, surrounded by his own scattered juggling pins with no clear sign of a struggle. The official verdict was that he had tripped and struck his head, yet he was known to be harassing the castle's steward with jokes about the man's embezzlement of funds. The death was just a little too convenient, the scene a little too perfectly staged to look like an accident. In another case, a jester renowned for his acrobatics was discovered at the bottom of a dry well, his neck broken. He had been drinking heavily at a feast, the court declared, and had stumbled in the dark. But this jester had an almost supernatural sense of balance, and his close friends insisted he could navigate the castle's highest parapets blindfolded, even when drunk. These accidental deaths force us to ask, were they truly mishaps, or were they meticulously arranged executions, designed by someone with the means and the motive to remove a troublesome voice without the scandal of a public execution? The perfect crime in the medieval court wasn't one that was never discovered. It was one that was never even investigated because the victim was, in the eyes of the powerful, just a fool. Perhaps the most poignant and unsettling vanishings are those of the jesters who simply faded into obscurity. These weren't dramatic assassinations or staged accidents, but a slow, quiet erasure. A jester who had fallen out of favor might be gradually sidelined. His appearances in the Great Hall would become less frequent. His name would drop off the guest lists for important feasts. He would be given smaller and smaller chambers, farther from the center of power, until one day he was just gone. No one could quite remember when they had last seen him. Had he been dismissed? Had he left of his own accord? Had he died of a broken heart in some forgotten attic room? For these individuals, the ultimate punishment was not death, but oblivion. Their legacy, their life's work of wit and observation, was deemed so insignificant that it wasn't even worth the effort of a formal dismissal or a covert murder. They were simply allowed to dissolve into the background, their final punchline being their own erasure from history. This fate, in its own quiet way, is as terrifying as any dagger, a stark reminder that in the court, being forgotten could be a more profound death than being executed. And so we arrive at the final, lingering echo of the jester's presence, a whisper that outlasts the crumbling stone of the castles they once called home. If their lives were a performance shrouded in secrecy, then their afterlives have become the stuff of pure folklore, their restless spirits refusing to leave the stage long after the final curtain has fallen. Across Europe, a peculiar and persistent genre of ghost story persists, one not of headless nobles or weeping ladies, but of the spectral fool, forever bound to the courts they served in life, their laughter and antics echoing through empty halls as an eternal, unanswered punchline to a joke only they can remember. Consider the atmosphere of a medieval castle at night, long after the tourists have left and the guides have gone home. The silence is profound, broken only by the settling of ancient timber and the whisper of the wind through arrow slits. It is in this palpable emptiness that the legends take root. There are countless reports from night watchmen, conservationists, and even skeptical historians who have spent evenings in these places, all telling similar tales. The sound of faint, jingling bells where no one stands, a cold spot in a corridor that feels inexplicably like being brushed past by a figure in motley. The fleeting glimpse of a colorful patchwork shadow darting around a corner, vanishing the moment you turn your head. These are not typically threatening apparitions. They are echoes of a presence that was, in life, defined by movement and sound. The ghost of a jester is rarely described as mournful or angry. Instead, the prevailing emotion attributed to them is a kind of perpetual, mischievous vigilance, as if they are still keeping watch, still performing their duty for a court that has turned to dust and a monarch whose name is only found in history books. One of the most famous of these spectral performers is said to haunt Hampton Court Palace on the outskirts of London. The ghost is identified as none other than Will Somers, the beloved fool of Henry VIII. For a spirit so closely associated with laughter in life, his posthumous appearances are surprisingly poignant. Visitors and staff alike have reported seeing his slight, shadowy figure in the Tudor courtyards, or hearing the distinct, soft sound of his laughter emanating from a room known to have been his favorite. On one occasion, a security camera even captured a mysterious figure in period dress, believed to be Somers, opening and closing fire doors deep within the palace's secured areas. What is most striking about his legend is its gentle nature. He is not a poltergeist throwing juggling pins or a sorrowful wraith. He is a lingering memory of loyalty, a man so bound to his king and his home that not even death could sever the connection. His ghost is a testament to the profound personal bonds that could form in that treacherous environment, a love that seemingly transcended the grave and keeps him forever in service. Yet not all jester ghosts are so benign. In the ancient dungeons of Chillingham Castle in Northumberland, England, a far more unsettling presence is said to reside. The story tells of a jester from the 16th century, a simple-minded man whose name has been lost, who was given the cruel task of entertaining the young children of the castle. The legend claims he grew deeply attached to them, seeing in their innocence a refuge from the brutality of the adult world. Tragically, the children fell ill and died during an outbreak of plague. The jester, heartbroken and perhaps feeling he had failed in his one pure duty, is said to have withdrawn into the castle's darkest underground passages, where he eventually died alone and forgotten. Now his spirit is said to be a thing of sorrow and confusion. Visitors to the dungeons report feeling a small, cold hand slip into theirs as if a child is seeking comfort. Others hear the faint, desperate sound of a man sobbing, mixed with the soft, pathetic jingle of bells. This ghost is no merry trickster. He is a vessel of eternal grief, a reminder that beneath the paint and laughter often lay a human being capable of profound love and loss, his final tragedy forever etched into the very stones of his prison. These haunting tales serve a deeper purpose than mere campfire fright. On a psychological level, the persistent ghost of a jester acts as the eternal conscience of the castle. In life, they were the only ones permitted to speak uncomfortable truths. In death, their lingering presence becomes a permanent reminder of those truths, a spectral whistleblower ensuring that the sins and secrets of the past are never fully buried. A castle haunted by its fool is a castle that cannot forget its own history, the injustices, the cruelties, the whispered plots that the jester witnessed and perhaps even helped orchestrate. The ghost becomes a symbolic safeguard against historical amnesia, its every appearance a silent declaration that the past, with all its complexity and moral ambiguity, is still very much present. Furthermore, these legends represent the ultimate, ironic triumph of the outsider. In life, the jester was the ultimate transient figure, welcomed for his talent but never truly belonging to the noble bloodlines he entertained. Yet, in a stunning reversal, it is the jester whose spirit is most often reported to remain, while the ghosts of the kings, queens, and dukes he served are far less common. The jester, the man with no lineage and no land, has achieved a form of immortality that eluded the most powerful families in Europe. He has outlasted them all, becoming the permanent resident of a realm he was only ever supposed to visit. His eternal presence in the castle is a final, brilliant subversion of the social order, a posthumous claim to a home that was never truly his in life. The laughter that echoes in the empty hall is no longer just for the king's amusement. It is the jester's own private joke on history itself, a punchline centuries in the making. So it was within the vibrant and chaotic world of the theatre that the court jester truly achieved immortality, his essence distilled and preserved for all time. While the royal courts of Europe faded into history, playwrights and philosophers seized upon the jester's potent contradictions, transforming him from a historical person into a timeless archetype, the fool, a character whose apparent nonsense reveals life's most profound and unsettling truths. Nowhere is this evolution more powerful or heartbreaking than in the works of William Shakespeare. The bard didn't just include jesters in his plays, he weaponized them, turning their licensed folly into a dramatic device that could expose the very soul of his characters and the corrupt societies they inhabited. In the storm-lashed tragedy of King Lear, the fool is not merely a comic sidekick. He is the king's rapidly dwindling conscience, a living, breathing alarm bell whose jingles and riddles chart the monarch's descent from arrogant power to naked, helpless humanity. From the moment Lear foolishly divides his kingdom, the fool is at his side not to comfort him, but to force him to see the catastrophic consequences of his own vanity. His humor is a scalpel, and he uses it without mercy. "Thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise," he tells the crumbling king, a line that carries the weight of 1,000 sermons. He calls Lear a shield peace cod, an empty pea podder, and tells him he has made his daughters his mothers. In the midst of the howling storm on the heath, when Lear's sanity is being stripped away by the elements, it is the fool who remains shivering beside him. He doesn't offer grand solutions, he offers companionship in the ruin, his presence a constant, painful reminder of the loyal, clear-eyed truth-teller the king should have listened to when he still had a kingdom to lose. And then, at the play's emotional nadir, the fool simply vanishes from the text his purpose served. He has guided Lear to the precipice of self-awareness, and with that final, terrible lesson delivered, the character who embodied reason in folly simply disappears, his absence echoing as loudly as his words ever did. Shakespeare, however, was a master of variety, and his exploration of the fool archetype was not confined to a single tragic note. In the sun-drenched, topsy-turvy world of Twelfth Night, he presents us with a different kind of wisdom altogether. Here, the Jester Fest is not a truth-teller raging against a storm, but a subtle puppeteer who manipulates the illusions of others for his own amusement and profit. He is an observer, a roaming intelligence who moves seamlessly between the households of the lovesick Duke Orsino and the grieving Countess Olivia. Fest's genius lies in his understanding that everyone around him is already playing a part. Orsino the perpetual lover, Olivia the professional mourner, Malvolio the arrogant steward. Fest doesn't need to impose truth upon them. He simply holds up a mirror to their self-deceptions, and they, in their vanity, do the rest. He is a professional, a working entertainer who uses his wit to earn his supper, singing melancholic songs for a coin and playfully out-arguing the noble Viola. His most famous declaration, "Better a witty fool than a foolish wit," is the manifesto of his character. He is self-aware, in control, and utterly unimpressed by the social hierarchies that entangle everyone else. His triumph over the puritanical Malvolio is the ultimate victory of flexible, joyous folly over rigid, joyless self-importance. Where Lear's fool is a heartbroken prophet, Fest is a philosophical mercenary of mirth, proving that the jester's wisdom could be as light and sharp as a razor, cutting through pretense not with tragic force but with impeccable, ironic timing. This literary transformation of the jester from court functionary to universal symbol was not confined to the English stage. Across the continent, the figure of the fool was taking on a new life in a revolutionary new medium, the printed book. In the early 16th century, the Dutch scholar Desiderius Erasmus penned In Praise of Folly, a satirical work that became a cornerstone of the Renaissance. The book is a long, learned oration delivered by Folly herself, personified as a goddess. She argues with dazzling rhetorical skill that all of human endeavor, from marriage and childbirth to statesmanship and war, and even the pursuit of wisdom itself, is fundamentally dependent on foolishness and self-delusion. Erasmus, through his narrator, turns the entire world into a court, and every person in it a kind of jester, blissfully unaware of their own motley. This was a philosophical earthquake. It took the jester's specific, licensed role and universalized it, suggesting that the only truly sane response to the madness of human existence was to embrace a certain enlightened folly. The wise fool was no longer just a character in a play. He was a model for how to live. To recognize one's own foolishness was the beginning of wisdom, an idea that would echo through the ages and find a home in everything from the gentle humor of Cervantes' Don Quixote to the absurdist plays of the 20th century. As we move forward in time, the jester's literary spirit continued to adapt, finding new forms and new masks. In the 19th century, while the historical court jester was a distant memory, his essential function was alive and well in the novel. Consider the character of Dobby the house elf in J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter series. While not a jester in the traditional sense, Dobby embodies the archetype of the loyal, powerless truth-teller who suffers for speaking out. He risks everything to warn Harry Potter of the dangers at Hogwarts, his initial, frantic efforts seen as mere mischief or madness by those who underestimate him. He is, in his own way, a natural fool, dismissed because of his station and his appearance, yet he possesses a moral clarity that the powerful wizards around him lack. His bravery and ultimate sacrifice complete the archetype's journey from the licensed critic of the medieval court to the voice of the oppressed whose truth, though initially mocked, proves to be the salvation of the hero. This evolution demonstrates the incredible durability of the Jester's core concept, the idea that the most important perspectives often come from the margins, from those whom the center of power has trained itself to ignore. The bells on the cap may be gone, but the essential, world-altering message remains the same. It might seem like the court jester vanished into the history books along with suits of armor and royal decrees, but the truth is far more fascinating. The archetype didn't disappear, it simply shed its motley and evolved, finding new stages and new mediums from which to speak truth to power. The essential function of the licensed fool to critique authority under the protective veil of humor is alive and well today, embodied by a diverse cast of modern figures who, knowingly or not, are walking in the jester's flamboyant footsteps. Consider the late-night satirical news host, a fixture of the modern media landscape. Think of a figure like Jon Stewart during his tenure on The Daily Show, or his successors like Stephen Colbert and John Oliver. They don't wear belled caps, but they absolutely wield a modern bauble, their television platform, and their designation as comedians. This grants them a form of jester's license, a unique permission to dissect political hypocrisy, expose corruption, and challenge official narratives in a way that a straight news anchor often cannot. Their entire format is a direct parallel to the jester's dual-layered performance. The studio audience's laughter is the modern equivalent of the court's chuckles, providing a backdrop of entertainment that allows for the delivery of sharply critical, deeply researched commentary. They use monologues and pre-taped segments in the same way a medieval fool used allegorical fables, to create a parallel universe where a silly story about a stubborn badger is actually a devastating critique of a senator's filibuster. Their power lies in this very ambiguity. If a politician tries to retaliate against a joke, they can be accused of having no sense of humor, of being thin-skinned, just like a king who couldn't tolerate his fool's barbs. They operate in a space that is both influential and, to a degree, protected by the public's understanding that it's just comedy, even when the content is deadly serious. Then there is the political cartoonist, a solitary figure whose pen is as sharp as any jester's tongue. For centuries, these artists have used exaggeration and symbolism to reduce powerful figures to their most absurd and revealing essence. A single panel can accomplish what a 1,000-word editorial cannot, cutting through complex political spin to deliver a simple, powerful, and often uncomfortable truth. The cartoonist, like the jester, relies on the shared understanding of metaphor. They might depict a world leader as a toddler throwing a tantrum or a giant corporation as an octopus enveloping the globe. This is not mere insult, it is a form of visual rhetoric that operates on the same psychological level as the jester's pantomime. And just like their medieval predecessors, cartoonists often face severe backlash for pushing their license too far. The tragic attack on the offices of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo is the most harrowing modern example of the risks these truth-tellers face. Their coxcomb, their identity as satirists, was not enough to protect them from those who refused to accept the rules of the game. This terrifying reality echoes the fate of jesters who told one truth too many, a stark reminder that the privilege of critique has always existed on a precipice where laughter can curdle into fury in an instant. Perhaps the most unpredictable and democratized evolution of the jester is the rise of the social media influencer as political commentator. Platforms like X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube have handed the bauble to anyone with a smartphone and a sharp wit. A person can build an audience of millions by creating short, viral skits that parody a political gaffe, or by crafting a thread that dismantles a corporate policy with sarcastic precision. This new generation of fools operates without a single patron. Their court is the algorithm, and their license is granted by the engagement of their followers. They possess the jester's traditional mobility, able to drift from one issue to another, and they share the same core technique, disarming a serious subject with humor to make a critical point more palatable and shareable. However, this new model also comes with familiar perils. These modern jesters face deplatforming, organized cancellation campaigns, relentless online harassment, and even legal threats from the powerful entities they mock. Their platform, while vast, is precarious, controlled by corporate interests that can revoke their access as easily as a king could dismiss his fool. They are the licensed fools of the digital town square, enjoying unprecedented reach but also facing a volatile and often anonymous version of the court's wrath. What connects all these modern figures to the jesters of old is not just their method, but the fundamental reason for their existence. They thrive in the gap between power and perception. In an age of intense political polarization and media distrust, people often turn to satirists and commentators not just for laughs, but for a sense of clarity and validation. They perform the jester's ancient role of the truth teller in disguise, cutting through the official spin and polished PR to point out the emperor's new clothes. They give voice to public sentiment and hold up a mirror to society's follies. And just like the court jester who had to carefully read the monarch's mood, these modern equivalents must constantly navigate the shifting landscape of public opinion and political correctness, understanding the precise line between a celebrated jab and a career-ending misstep. The costume has changed and the court is now global, but the delicate, dangerous dance remains exactly the same. A performance where the price of a misjudged punchline is no longer the dungeon, but can be the utter collapse of one's reputation and livelihood. For all the names that have echoed through history, for every Tribulate and Will Sommers whose stories we've pieced together, there remains a vast and silent void in our understanding. These are the stories that were never written down, the secrets that died with their keepers, leaving behind only tantalizing whispers and questions that may forever defy answers. Who, for instance, was the most powerful jester in history whose name has been utterly lost to us? We know of Archibald Armstrong's wealth and influence, but what of the brilliant, shadowy figure who operated with such subtlety that he never appeared in a single chronicle? A man or woman who shaped the fate of nations from the shadows, their identity erased by their own flawless discretion. Their power was so complete, their manipulation of court politics so seamless, that they left no visible footprint, their greatest achievement being their own anonymity. Imagine a fool in the court of a crumbling empire, whose whispered counsel in the emperor's ear not only averted a civil war but redirected the course of a dynasty, all while the official historians credited a general or a bishop with the salvation. That unknown jester, the true architect of peace, represents the ultimate ghost in the machine of history, a reminder that the most influential figures are sometimes the ones whose names we will never know. Then there is the chilling question of the single most dangerous secret a jester was ever forced to carry. We can speculate about political conspiracies or proofs of illegitimate birth, but perhaps the most volatile secret of all was one of identity. Consider the possibility, whispered in some of the more speculative historical theories, of a royal substitution. What if a jester was the only living soul, aside from the queen and a single midwife, who knew that a stillborn heir had been secretly swapped with a healthy commoner's child? This jester would hold the key to the entire legitimacy of the reigning monarchy, a truth that could shatter a kingdom and plunge it into generations of war if revealed. The psychological burden of such a secret is almost unimaginable. Every time they looked at the king on the throne, they would see the lie. Every time they performed for the royal family, they would be acting out a charade they knew to be false. The weight of that knowledge would be a constant, crushing presence, a sword of Damocles hanging over their own head, knowing that revealing it would mean their immediate execution and unleashing chaos, yet living with the lie every day. The dangerous secret wasn't always a plot against the king. sometimes it was the very foundation of the king's identity, and the jester was the lone, terrified guardian of that reality. This leads us to the most compelling mystery of all. Was there a master jester, a shadowy grandmaster of this secret fraternity, who manipulated events from behind the scenes across multiple courts and generations? The idea of a clandestine network, as we've discussed, is plausible, but what if it was more organized and more ambitious than we ever suspected? What if there was a single, brilliant individual, perhaps a jester who had retired to a secluded monastery or a forgotten castle, who acted as a spy master for the entire profession? This puppet master would have received intelligence from fools in London, Paris, and Vienna, compiling a panoramic view of European politics no single monarch could ever possess. Using this intelligence, he could have sent coded instructions, a specific song to be sung in the French court that would trigger an action in the English one, or a particular gesture to be used in a performance in Rome that would signal a nobleman in Madrid. His goal wouldn't be the service of any one king, but the stability of the entire continent, or perhaps the furtherance of a mysterious personal agenda. The master jester would be the ultimate unseen hand, proving that the real power in the medieval world may not have always rested on the throne, but in the mind of the one person everyone was conditioned to ignore. Beyond these grand conspiracies, simpler, more human mysteries haunt the record. We know jesters traveled, but did any of them undertake journeys of exploration? Was there a fool on one of Columbus's ships, or in the retinue of Marco Polo, using his license to document the wonders of the New World or the East in a coded, satirical journal that now sits undeciphered in some forgotten archive? What about the ultimate act of defiance? Did a jester ever fall in love with a queen or a princess, their affair hidden in plain sight through a public performance of animosity, their secret rendezvous arranged through the very signals meant for espionage? The court was a pressure cooker of human emotion, and the jester was at its center, privy to every passion and vice. The greatest mystery may not be one of politics, but one of the heart, a tragic romance so perfectly concealed by the art of folly that its existence can only be guessed at, a story of love and loss whose final chapter was never told. These unanswered questions are the ghostly echoes of the jester's world, reminding us that history is not just the story of what we know, but the profound and haunting silence of everything we have lost. So as we reach the end of our journey through the secret corridors of the medieval court, let's pull back one final time to see the complete picture. The figure that emerges is a stunning contradiction, a character of profound depth and staggering complexity. The court jester was never simply a clown. He was a political operative, a master psychologist, a sanctioned spy, and a keeper of the realm's most volatile secrets, all wrapped in the brilliant disguise of a laughing fool. That laughter was his greatest invention, a mask of insignificance that allowed him to operate in plain sight, his jingling bells drowning out the whisper of his true intentions. While nobles plotted in shadowy corners, the jester conducted his most dangerous business in the bright, public light of the throne room, using his unique license to speak truths that would have cost any other person their head. His costume was a uniform of calculated absurdity, his bauble a mock scepter that held more real power than anyone dared to admit, and his entire life a continuous, breathtaking performance on the razor's edge between celebrated wit and condemned treason. The world of the jester was one of impossible dualities. He was the ultimate insider who remained a perpetual outsider, cherished for his humor yet always one misstep from the dungeon. He could amass great wealth and influence like Archibald Armstrong, yet his power was entirely borrowed, vanishing the moment his patron's favor turned. He could be a loyal confidant, offering solace to a dying king like Will Somers, or a vengeful turncoat, slowly poisoning a monarch's mind against his own allies. He navigated a shadowy world of unwritten codes and silent understandings, a member of a secret fraternity that passed down the art of survival from one generation to the next. From the gallows humor that defied the despair of the Black Death to the coded ballads that transmitted intelligence on the battlefield, the Jester proved to be one of the most versatile and resilient figures in all of history, his role evolving to meet every crisis while his core purpose, to speak the unspeakable, remained constant. This brings us to the final, lingering question that hangs in the air long after the last echo of laughter has faded. What was the ultimate price of this extraordinary life? We have seen the legends of those who fell from grace, like Armstrong, cast out for a single joke that cut too deep. We've heard the whispers of those who vanished without a trace, their knowledge making them a liability to a new regime. The price was a life lived in a state of perpetual high-stakes calculation, where every word was weighed, every gesture analyzed, and every laugh from the audience could be either a reprieve or a prelude to doom. The psychological toll of this double existence is almost impossible to fathom. To be the guardian of so many dark secrets, to wear a mask of folly every waking moment, to love and serve a master who held the power of life and death over you, this was the true cost of the Jester's license. It was a bargain with power itself, a deal that traded personal safety for a unique and terrifying form of freedom, a freedom that was as fragile as it was profound. And so, the legacy of the court jester is not confined to the history books. It is a timeless archetype that challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question authority, and to recognize that wisdom often speaks through the most unexpected voices. They teach us that truth and power have always existed in a delicate, often dangerous dance, and that sometimes the most courageous act is to tell a king he is naked, so long as you have the wit to make him laugh while you do it. The next time you encounter a satirist challenging a modern politician, or a comedian using humor to expose a hard truth, remember the colorful, belled figures who perfected this art centuries ago. They were the original masters of speaking truth to power, and their stories are a permanent testament to the enduring power of intelligence, courage, and laughter in the face of overwhelming authority. Now we turn the final page over to you. The history of the court jester is filled with as many mysteries as it is with documented facts. Was there a grandmaster of the Fool's Guild pulling strings across Europe? What is the most tantalizing jester secret you believe was lost to time? Or perhaps you have a favorite legendary fool whose story we haven't even touched upon. The comments are your court, and your thoughts are most welcome. Share your theories, your favorite mysteries, and your own insights. Let's continue the conversation and see what other secrets we can uncover together.